This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, so we're
for a while.
Rabbi Glatstein, did you turn around the same thing?
20 years ago. Why? Your son went there too?
so Parshas Zachor. We're going to learn something amazing about the language of the Torah. How does the Torah speak? The Torah's choice of phrase, the Torah's choice of language is different from the way that we speak. And what we're going to learn is when the Torah says somebody did something wrong, it's highly exaggerated. The Torah speaks in a highly exaggerated form. Who says? How could we say such a thing? So, let's take a look. Let us see.
How does that jive with the
It's exaggerated from our point of view, but from the point of view of the author, it's absolutely accurate. In other words, when the Torah says somebody did an Aveira, or somebody sinned terribly, for us it would be a dakos of sin. From the point of view of the creator of the universe, it is a terrible sin. And we'll see what we mean. This is, we're going to see a lot from the writing of the Or HaTzafon. I don't know if we've read the Sefer inside before. The Or HaTzafon are the Musar Shmuzin of the Alter of Slabodka. The Alter of Slabodka, we know, is pretty much responsible for practically most of the yeshivos in the world today. How can you say such a thing? Most of the Rashi yeshivas that founded the main yeshivas all over the world were Talmidim of the Alter of Slabodka. Chaim Berlin, Rav Hutner, Tarvadas, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky was a very close Talmud of the Alter of Slabodka. Rav David Leibowitz, the founder of Yeshiva Chavetz Chaim, was a close student of the Alter of Slabodka. Rav Shach, Rav Aaron Kotler, these are all Talmidim of the Alter of Slabodka. Rav Ruderman and Ar Yisrael, Talmidim of the Alter of Slabodka. Practically, the Olam HaYeshivos originated in Slabodka. You know, of course, you have the Brisk dynasty, which is different, but the Alter of Slabodka is very much responsible for much of the Torah we have today. And even other Gedolim that learned in Slabodka after the Alter, Rabbi Victor Miller was a Talmud of Slabodka, but already a Talmud of the son-in-law of the Alter of Slabodka, Rav Isaac Sher, right, and Rabbi Avram Grzinski. But Slabodka is like the mother of the continuum of Volozhin and the mother of the yeshivos. Okay. What?
Didn't we have people from Radin who also formed...
As the Chafetz Chaim said to the Alter, Chafetz Chaim said to the Alter, I write Sfarim and you produce Talmidim. The Chafetz Chaim had a very small yeshiva in Radin, where Chafetz Chaim founded the yeshiva, but he wasn't the Rosh Yeshiva. He hired Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Naftali Trupp and others. Okay.
But
So...
Velkin was also a Talmud from... Well, he didn't find why he did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. HaTorah, Torah's Hashem. Now the Or HaTzafon was not written by the Alter of Slabodka. It was written by one of his Talmidim, Rav Dov Katz, who also wrote 5-volume work called Tnuas HaMusar. And he says the following: HaTorah, Torah's Hashem, yesh la safa acheres. The Torah has a different language, the signo no eloki, and a different parlance, a different form of speaking. Asher eno mizdaha tamid im lashon bnei adam. It's not the same way that we speak. Yesh asher haTorah nosenes la'averos mesuyamos tiurim chamurim. The Torah may ascribe to certain actions very harsh descriptions. Umalbisha osam bitsura shalmasa pesha kavedim lemait. The Torah may describe certain infractions as very severe. Ube'emes einam ela mishkim dakim, when in truth they are just minor, subtle deviations. B'machshava, sometimes only in thought. Or b'kavana, she'einanu royim b'hem kol keshem, also ma'isa pesha. We see the Torah describe something as a terrible sin, and when yet, if you learn the Gemara about what the person actually did wrong, we sort of scratch our heads. That was a terrible sin that the Torah describes as such a terrible sin. V'amnam lefi musege hatara. That is because based on the barometer of the Hashem, kol mishga dak pesha kavedu. Every deviance is in fact a terrible rebellion. And in heaven they consider it like one of the most severe infractions. For example, and you'll see what this has to do with Parshas Zachor. The Torah says, "Vayi bishkon Yisrael ba'aretz hahi." When Yaakov was living in that land, Vayelech Ruvain, Vayishkav es Bila Pilegesh Aviv. Ruvain lay with Bila, his father's concubine. And we know that that's not really what happened. Ruvain, in fact, did not live with Bila. What did he do? After his mother Leah passed away, so he figured, after Rachel passed away, so Ruvain figures the next in line is Leah. So therefore Yaakov should set up shop in Leah's tent. But because he moved the bed from Bila into Leah's tent, it was considered as if he sort of meddled into Yaakov's private affairs. Umeyad ba'osa pasuk suv. But in that very pasuk, the next very pasuk says, "Vayu b'nei Yaakov shnei masar." There were 12 equal righteous sons of Yaakov. Amru Chazal kol ha'omer Ruvain chata eino elataya. If you say Ruvain sinned, you're making a mistake. Shenemar vayu b'nei Yaakov shnei masar melamed shekulan shkulan ka'achas. But the pasuk says vayishkav in Bila pilegesh aviv elamani mekayim vayishkav es Bila pilegesh aviv melamed shebilbel matzua shel aviv umala olav hakasav keilu shachav imayir. Because he interfered with the bed arrangements. What did he do already? He didn't live with Bila. He didn't look at Bila. But in the eyes of Hashem, it's as if he was shachav. He actually had an illicit affair with his father's wife, which is a chiv misa. So in reality, what did he do? It was slightly a lack of modesty. But that's not how the Torah describes it. The description of the Torah is arayos. Tanya Rishim and Elazar Omer, Mutzel Oisei Tzadik Me Oisei Avain. That tzaddik was completely spared from that sin. He never did anything. You think his descendants were destined to stand up on Har Evel and to say, and he's going to actually sin that way? Right? He was just taking up the disgrace of his mother. Just because my mother's sister, Rachel, was the co-wife of my mother and was her competitor, the maidservant of the sister of my mother should be my mother's competitor. Just because Rachel was my mother's competitor, Bila, the Shivcha, should be her competitor. Amaru Bilba Smatzah. So what do we see from here? Hare mochichim Chazal. Chazal are showing us Ruvain leichata. Ruvain never sinned. And we are prohibited from even contemplating that Ruvain sinned. Just the opposite. What was Ruvain doing? He was doing a mitzvah.
Yeah, he tended to
keep it of aim. He was doing a mitzvah. And he saw after Rachel died, not Yaakov mitasai, that Yaakov took his bed. That was always in Rachel's tent. If you would have asked Reuven, what are you involved in? He probably said, I am involved in the great mitzvah of honoring my mother. Before I'm doing this, I'm being mechavein, that I want to fulfill the mitzvah of kaved asavicha v'yasach. Basher chashav shiruya laresha says makayma shel rachav le'bil shivchasa. He paskin halacha l'maisa. His mother was the inheritor of the right to be with Yaakov. And yet, what does the Torah describe this act? Not as a mitzvah, not as a minor infraction of modesty, not as a major infraction of modesty, as a complete, open, illicit relation. The Torah describes this as one of the worst sins.
Probably this Yitzchak should have asked his father, would you like me to help you out and move the bed?
His intention was
Not
good.
to have the, it's almost chutzpahdik that he should go take it without asking.
So you know what the Torah should say? Vayelech Ruvain, v'hayak kitzas az shaloi sha'al es avim. But that he lived with his father's wife? I mean, that's not what happened. But in the eyes of Hashem, meddling in the private affair of a parent is akin to arayos. That's the way the Torah speaks. The language of the Torah is different than our language. That's the principle that the author of Sabbatka sets forth. The Torah's language system is different than our language. We may see a minor infraction, but from the eyes of Hashem, a minor infraction is a stain on the neshama. Right? It's like you have, it's like this. You're going to a wedding, you have a white tuxedo, right? You get a little bit of ketchup on it, forget it. And what if you have a really nice silk tie, $250 silk tie, that it says don't even bother dry cleaning, just throw it right out, and you get a little bit on that tie, forget it. So Hashem, we don't value the neshama. We don't understand. We just view it as like a shmata, an undershirt. Oh, okay, so we got a little stain on the undershirt. We'll wash it off in some cold water. Hashem doesn't see it as an undershirt. Hashem sees it as a jewel, as a pure neshama, with the slightest stain is Vayelech Ruvain Vayishkav Im Pelei. Oh, so what does this have to do with anything? Okay. We have a mitzvah to remember Amalek. For what? For what purpose? We have a mitzvah to kill Amalek, that I understand. If Yadeinu Tkifan, we had the opportunity, we had the ability, and we had our own government, so we would have to fulfill that mitzvah. But what's the point of remembering if we can't kill them?
Well, if you don't remember, you'll forget.
So we'll forget. Why do we have to remember? We have to remember the Avera that we did that brought about Amalek. What was the Avera? We have to remember the cause. Says, look in number 2. This is the Arat Safan in the second section of Shmuzin.
Yesterday, Wednesday, we spoke a great deal about Amalek and the relationship with how they denied the existence of God's Baruch. And we didn't once mention, as I recall, that the reason for Amalek's existence was an Aveira by the Bnei Israel.
Then what was I going to say today? You know.
Good point, Shay.
Wednesday was, Amalek's point of view. Now, what did we do to bring him on? That's a different story. Okay, so look in number 2, the paragraph Vihine. Vihine matzino v'divrei Chazal shehem tolen es hasiba shaba Amalek li'lachem b'Yisrael b'zeh shehisrapu milimod haTorah. Chazal identify that the cause that brought about Amalek was the fact that we slackened off in Torah. Where do they see that? HaKosav Omer, Vayavay Amalek, Vayilachem, Im Yisrael, B'Rafidim. What now? Rafidim is a place. But why do we need to know the name of the place? V'darshu Chazal, Ein Rafidim, Ela Rifyon Yadayim. Rafidim means their hands weakened. Why? Lefi Sharafu, Yedeyem, Midivrei Torah, Lekach Nemar, Hasone, Lekach Ba Hasone Aleim. In other words, because we weakened off in learning, therefore the enemy came. Okay, so let's now picture, if Amalek was coming to kill us, and Chazal are saying, we weakened off in Torah, let's try to picture in our mind, how did they weaken off? So we would probably say, well, every day, they started off, spending 24 hours a day in the Beis Medrash. And if Chazal are saying they weakened off in learning, that probably means they closed their Gemaras. Maybe they locked up the Gemaras in a closet. And they went to play golf. And then after golf, they went to watch the baseball game. And after the baseball game, they went to check their stocks. And after the stocks, they went to the restaurant. And they didn't open up the Gemara at all.
No, that wouldn't be weak. That would be denying. Weakened, maybe they went from 24 hours to 23 hours.
So let us try to understand, if the Torah is saying they weakened, what does that mean? Because remember, we've already established that the Torah is highly exaggerated. And what the Torah calls arayos, we would call the mitzvah of kibbud av v'em.
How much mitzvahs did they have anyhow at that point in time in the history?
What?
They didn't get the Torah yet.
Well, they didn't even have the Torah yet, right? But still, right? Like Paska Yeshiva Mimena, and they had Mixas mitzvahs from Mara, and
No, Mara is not yet. They didn't get there yet. Mara is like next week.
no, right after the Yam, they came to Mara, right? And after Mara, right? Okay. And even in Mitzrayim, they had Megillos Shenesasku Bahem. Okay.
Rabbi Glatstein,
Yeah.
if because they were weakened, even
Yeah.
though we know the exaggeration
Yeah.
in their Lina Torah,
Yeah.
that was the result, that was the causative effect that Amalek should be our enemy, Midor Ador. Kavachomer, what could possibly the Torah say about Cheda Egel and Avodah Zarah? And I know some say the Egel wasn't a...
Let's see.
That was Yitzchak's bracha.
Let's see. Hine nisbonin mamash ma'uso shel remezeh sheberafidim lefi musagei Torah. According to the value system of the Torah, what does it mean they weakened in Torah? Kvar amarnu b'ma'amarenu hakoidmin al lashon haTorah. We've already established in previous compositions the language of the Torah. Kama hishona mehamusagim shalanu. How different it is from our understanding. In other words, what we would call something is not how the Torah describes it. Right? We've already explained that even the slightest infraction, the Torah blows it up. Right? Sometimes, I have a sefer, it's tiny, tiny, tiny letters. If I want to have Rachmanis on you, I bring it to the copy machine, and I blow it up 250 times. Right? If I don't want to have Rachmanis on you, like this page, I made it smaller, 88% of it. But right, sometimes if it's really small, and Charlie's going to tell me, Rabbi, what do you do? So I tell him, I'm giving your eyes exercise. But I blow it up. I blow it up. That's what the Torah is doing. The Torah blows up the Avera. Okay, and then the author goes on to say, he gives a few examples that. In the Navi Yecheskel, in Parak Yirches, as the pasuk says, to the mount El Haharim lo ochal ve'enov lo nasa El Gilula Beis Yisrael ves Eish Yisrael lo timeh ule Eish Nida le karav. Here, the Gemara is describing 4 different averos. The Navi is describing 4 different averos: idol worship, adultery, and living with a nida. So we would think, wow, these are terrible averos. When in fact, the averos that they're describing is not using and not tapping into zechus avos. When it says they didn't worship idols, it refers to they were not arrogant. When it says they did not commit adultery, it means they did not infringe on their friend's business. And when it says they did not live with a nida, it means they did not take a penny from tzedakah if they didn't need it. So here you have a completely different language system. The Navi says that if you infringe on your friend's business, it's adultery. If you live with a nida, what does that refer to? Taking tzedakah improperly. So again, this is another illustration of how the language system of Tanakh is a completely different language system than we use. And the author goes on to say that the Torah is even more exaggerated than the Navi. In other words, if the Navi considers infringing on your friend's business adultery and taking improper tzedakah, like living with the nida, and that's the ratio. In other words, you see the Navi's language, the ratio is taking tzedakah is like living with the nida. Infringing on your friend's business is like adultery. Then the ratio of the Torah is even greater. In other words, you could blow something up on the copy machine 200 times. You could blow it up 1,000 times. If the Navi blows up in a sin 200 times, the Torah will blow it up even 1,000 times. In other words, the Torah is even more directly the point of view of God Himself. So however much exaggerated the language of the Navi is, even more than that is the language of the Chumash. Okay. So let's just imagine for 1 minute. If the Torah says refidim, that Klal Yisrael weakened in learning, we should just imagine how super exaggerated that is. Okay? So you can imagine what a slight, tiny imperfection their lack of learning was, right? If the Torah doesn't say they threw away the learning. The Torah doesn't say they were mavatel from learning. Just listen to this. The Torah could have said they forsook learning, and if the Torah would have said they forsook learning, we could just imagine probably one time while they were learning, they were not concentrating 100%. But the Torah doesn't even say they forsook their learning. The Torah doesn't even say they were mavatel from their learning. The Torah doesn't even say they weakened in learning. The Torah just says the name of a place. From that place we infer, if it's called Rafidim, that they were slightly lacking in the learning. And if the language of the Torah is so super exaggerated, you could just imagine that their lack of concentration and attachment to learning was on such a microscopic level that we could not even detect it, right? If the language of the Torah is so super exaggerated, and the Torah doesn't even say they forsook learning, they were mavatel from learning, they didn't learn, they were weak in learning, the Torah just says a name, and from there we infer they were rafu yudei min Torah, and if that language itself is so blown up, the Avera must have been super exaggerated. Now, listen to this. Look in Dalet, look in Os Dalet.
The result of the Avera is...
the results were terrible. The results were terrible. In other words, what we're learning is the slightest deviation from Limud HaTorah brings catastrophic results. And now, Midah Tova Meruba. If a person strengthens himself in Torah in just even the slightest, tiniest bit, imagine, right? Imagine if a person said, I'm going to learn an extra 10 minutes a week. That's not microscopic. You could see that. If the devastating effects of even a microscopic deviation from Torah are so strong, imagine the tremendous blessing that Hashem will give us from making the smallest increase and added attachment to Limud Torah.
It doesn't obviate. If you make a very small incremental addition, you still have a lot to go to overcome the onesh for not being entirely devoted.
Okay, but
so I mean, you're on your big debit. You get a little bit of a credit. You still got a big debit
compared to where you are. Right now, you're being judged where you are. If you add to it, it will spell tremendous difference. The same way a microscopic diminution spells catastrophic. Right? It's like the atom bomb. You move it one microscopic degree one way, it has tremendous effects. You make it. Right? You're shooting a missile. If the angle is a microscopic degree lower, it will end up in one country. If it's a microscopic degree higher, it will end up in a different continent. Right? Because, in other words, the Torah that God entrusted us with is something of such massive consequences that the slightest deviation for bad or for good spells the biggest difference in the world. Now look in Dalet. Umikan Navo, by the way, this is classic Slabotka Musar. This is Slabotka Musar at its finest, right? Where you take, you'll see what I mean. Look in Os Dalet. Look in Os Dalet. Umikan Navo lahavin es haremesh shabamila rafidim. From this, we can understand a little bit the remez and the word rafidim. Anu motzim b'divrei Chazal. We find in the words of Chazal, Peirosh, an explanation, Al ha-musag ha-nikra b'lashon ha-naviyim azivas ha-Torah. The understanding of what the Navi means when he says we forsook the Torah. Right? Let's get the level straight. If you want to say somebody deviated from the Torah, what would be the most severe way of saying it? Azvam es Torasi. They forsook the Torah. What would be a little bit less? They didn't forsake it, but they were mavatel. Sometimes they didn't do it. What would be a little bit less? Rafu yudei min Torah. They weakened in the Torah. What would be a little bit less? You say a place. That place alludes to the fact that they weakened a little bit. So, the word Rafidim is many, many degrees separated from the language of Azvam es Torasi. Now, we find in Chazal that there was a point in time when Klal Yisrael was Azvam es Torasi. Anybody remember what that meant? When the Navi Yirmiyah says that Klal Yisrael was Azvam es Torasi, you know what that means, says the Gemara? It means, how did they forsake the Torah? They were learning Torah so much, and they became so accustomed to learning Torah at all times, that they didn't take a break every morning to say Berchas HaTorah. That's what it means, Azvam es Torasi. Forsaking Torah means They learned so much that they started to unappreciate the value of it, that they didn't say a bracha.
Well, didn't we also learn that you could learn and learn and learn, but if you don't apply to your lifestyle...
But that's not what they did. That's not what happened.
Learning is worthless.
No, but that's not what happened.
Well, they forgot to make the bracha.
No, but that's not why they forgot to make the bracha. They forgot to make the bracha because they were so involved in learning that it was almost like they never stopped. Right? Imagine if you're up all night and all day. You don't make a bracha. What? Shavuos morning. Shavuos morning we don't make a bracha, right? If you're so engrossed in learning, they were so involved in engrossed in learning, this is what they do. They breathe. You don't make a bracha when you breathe. Why? How could you? That's what you're doing all day, all night. They were so involved in learning, they didn't make brachas Torah. That's what the Torah calls azvam es terasi. They forsook the Torah. So you could just imagine when the Torah says, not azva es terasi, not they were mavato from learning, not they slackened off, but refidim, which is a hint to rifyon yadam Torah. You could just imagine. You just can't imagine what microscopic diminution in Torah there was. Look what he says. Hanavi Yirmiyahu Matayar es hasiba shebeglala ba hachorban liYisrael. Yirmiyahu Hanavi describes the cause that brought about the destruction of Kaisel va'omer, and he says like this: Mihaish hachacham bi'avin esayis. Who is the man, the wise man, who understands this? Va'asher diber pi Hashem elav yagida. And who is the man that God spoke to? He will tell us. Alma of the Haaretz. Why was Israel destroyed? Vayem Hashem al azam es Torasi. They forsook my Torah. And the Gemara explains, what does this mean, they forsook my Torah? Davar zeh nishal lechachamim. This matter was asked to the Chachamim, v'lanaviyim, and to the prophets, v'lei pershu. No one could know. You hear what's happening here? They asked the Gedolei Hadar, why is the land being destroyed? Nobody knew. Can you imagine? They asked all the Gedolim, and they said, Gedolim, why are the Jewish people being removed from the land? Nobody knew. They asked the prophets, what are the Jewish people doing wrong? You surely know. We can't see anything. Until Hashem himself explained it, She'ein mavarchen b'Torah tchila. They don't make brachas Torah. Kolomar, shehachachamim v'anavim lo yardu la'omek hadvarim. They couldn't comprehend. V'lo yachlu lahasig ma haya cheta shel Yisrael shehevi alav chorban kazeh. They couldn't understand what brought about the destruction. Rak HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'yatzmai. Only God Himself, haboichein klayos v'lev, who can probe the heart and the kidneys. Hu gila es chetam. He uncovered their sin. Shalahayim avarchem b'Torah tchila. Now, why didn't they make the brachas Torah? Umeva Rashi, Kishemashkim in Latam Torah. When they woke up early in the morning to learn, v'tamidi chachamim, the Torah sages, mitoch shehem zihir and lasik b'Torah or gilimba, because they were so careful to learn Torah at all times. Einon zihir and levarech, they sort of lost track and they didn't make a bracha. So, and what does the Navi describe that as? Azvam es Torah. They forsook it completely. Forsook it completely. If we would sum up the situation, we would have wrote an article in the newspaper. The Jewish people today are in the highest level of Torah knowledge ever. They learn Torah 24 hours a day. They wake up in the morning, they go to the Beis Medrash in the afternoon, then the Beis Medrash in the night, they're in the Beis Medrash. An unparalleled level of Torah study. And yet Hashem calls it, you forsook my Torah. So what do you see from here? The language of the Navi is highly exaggerated. So you can imagine if the Navi was describing, imagine if the Navi said Refidim, what a microscopic level of diminution of Torah that would be. And now just apply that, now that the Torah says Refidim, again, the Torah blows things up even more than the Navi blows it up. Right? The Navi calls Azvam es Torasi what we would call Hasmada. Imagine what a microscopic level of lack of Torah the Navi would consider Refidim. And now imagine if the Torah says Refidim, what a completely undetectable level of Rifyon Yadayim there must have been in the Jewish people's Torah.
It's still very hard to imagine that the onesh of this Refidim resulted in Amalek and Midoladah.
Right?
It's hard to imagine that.
Although the Navi writes explicitly they forsook the Torah, that's not what it means. To the point the sages, the Nevi'im, we're not talking about sages in our time. We're talking about sages before the Arizal, right? They could look at your forehead, they could tell you everything you ever thought that was wrong. And they said, we don't see anything wrong over here. The Jews are on the highest possible level. They could not detect any infraction. The kavana is for the slightest infraction. And listen to this, Rabbi Isai. It wasn't in any infraction in the Torah itself. It was an infraction in the Birchas HaTorah. Right? Something only God Himself could reveal. Zos mishtamish hanavi betiur hapagam hadak hazeh belashon chamur kazos v'omer al azam es torasi. This slight infraction, the Navi calls azam es torasi, which we take to mean the sefer is open and they walk out on the sefer. So now let's go back to Amalek. Look in Osei. Yeah. Osei. Zuhi mashmos lashon hanavua. This is the terminology of the Navi. Ukvar amarnu, and we've already explained she'im lashon hanavua chamura kol kach. If the language of the prophet is so severe, alachas kam v'kam lashon haTorah. All the more so, the language of the Torah. Now listen to this. If the Torah would have said, why did Amalek come? We would be forced to say it's for an infraction less than the azvam es Torasi in the Navi. Because we know the language of the Torah is even more exaggerated than the Lashon of the Navi. Right? If the Torah would have said Amalek came al azam es Torasi, we would be forced to say it was for some kind of slackening off less than the azam es Torasi in the Navi. But the Torah doesn't say al azam es Torasi. Vim haya kasav Torah shaba Amalek al bitul Torah. What if the Torah would have written that Amalek didn't come al azam es Torasi, but al bitul Torah? Bitul Torah implies we don't forsake our learning, but once in a while we goof off. It would have been even for a more minuscule infraction. What if the Torah would have written explicitly that Amalek came because Rafu Yudayim in our Torah, our hands slackened in Torah, would have been for even a more minuscule infraction. But nevertheless, the Torah does not write any of the above. The Torah writes Rafidim. Rafidim is only a remez to Rafu Yudayim in our Torah. I'm in Hey now. Kamadak hapagam sha'af belashan haTorah lo'nizkar olav shum bitoy al eza rifyon shumei haTorah. Just imagine now the Torah will not even write their hands were weakened in Torah. Rakasav shem hamakom. All it says is the name of the place.
Now how does this contrast to Kriya Shema, where it says?
Amalek, 1 second. Lihilachem b'Yisrael v'hu Refidim. They just say the name of the place that Amalek came to, and that's Refidim. Ella Shebesham Hamakan Hazeh, the name of this place, Efshar Limsai Remez Sharafu Yudayim B'Natorah. What do we see from here, Rabbi Isai? The language of the Torah is completely different than our value system. And this small, minuscule Avera, that is undetectable, what were the results? The results were so severe, where God swears that His name has been made incomplete, and His throne has been made incomplete because of this slight, microscopic diminution in Limud HaTorah.
How does this compare to Kriya Shema, where it says, and Los Tishmu, and it says, I won't bring the rain in the time, and it's full. So we have clear cut as if you don't listen. But
you have to know exactly.
Which is ostensibly one of the worst things that happened to us, that the Torah just gives us a remez?
Imlai Sishmu means... Yeah. Also, even a slight if a person slackens off even in the slightest amount, that's also a lois tishmu.
Is flat out a statement. Here we have to learn
No.
through a remez.
It's flat out, but in the Torah's parlance, a flat out statement is highly exaggerated. In other words, when the Torah says, if you don't listen to me, this will be the result, even the slightest deviation is included in lois tishmu. If the Torah describes not making Birchas HaTorah Ozvam as Torasi.
The Torah says in Lo Tishmu. But for us to learn about Amalek, it's through a remez. I mean, it doesn't say.
No, it's not through a remez. The Torah says Amalek came,
but it doesn't say why.
So what do you see? You see that when it comes to Limud HaTorah, even the slightest deviation and slackening off in Limud HaTorah brings devastating results. Right? Limud HaTorah is the most important mitzvah we have, right? There's no question. That's the most basic job of a Jew. The most elementary obligation we have is Limud HaTorah. The Gemara says that children came into the Beis Medrash, and it says they darshan things that even bimos Yishur benon loy nishmu kamayu. They darshan the Aleph Beis. Aleph Beis, Gimel Daled. Aleph Beis stands for Aleph Bina, learn Torah. Gimel Daled, Gimel Dalim. Chafetz Chaim points out, what do you see from here? Aleph Beis, what's the Aleph Beis of being a Jew? Learning Torah. The next thing, Gimel Daled, right? People get caught up in all of these extraneous types of service. This segula, that segula, this is a good omen for that, and if you go here and you give these amount of coins to this, at this place, those things are not mentioned. The most basic obligation, Rav Victor Miller used to say, for a Jew, Baba Kama, Mesilas Yisharim. That's all you need to know. Baba Kama, Mesilas Yisharim. And of course, Aleph Beis is Aleph Bina, Gmal Dalim is Gmilas Chasadim. But if a Jew learns Torah, does Chasad, he's already, he has his meat and potatoes. But especially Limud HaTorah, right? We've mentioned here that of all the Avos, none of them were attacked, except for Yaakov Avinu, right? Nobody ever starts up with Abraham. Nobody ever starts off with Yitzchak. Yaakov Avinu, all of a sudden, the Malach, he wants to kill him. Well, what's the problem with Yaakov? Right, the Chafetz Chaim says, Avraham Avinu is Chesed. Yitzhar doesn't like Chesed, but he could swallow it. Yitzchak Avinu is Tefillah, doesn't like it, he'll turn the other way. Torah, forget it. Because Yitzhar knows, Barasi Yitzhara, Barasi Torah Tavlin. Right? Emes Kenei Al Timkar. The Torah. The Torah is the kryptonite of the Yitzhara. A Jew who learns Torah, that's how he could fight the Yitzhara. A Jew who doesn't learn Torah, you show me a Jew who doesn't learn Torah, that person is completely overtaken by the Yitzhara. There's no other medication. God created the Yitzhara, and He's telling you there's only one medicine. Imagine, you go to the doctor, he says, this is the makkah, here's the refuah. So, you don't take that medicine, nothing's going to happen, right? I think it's better to eat carrots instead of taking that medicine. Okay, you'll see what happens, right? Hashem says, I created the Yitzhara, and I'm telling you there's only one cure. There's only one cure. The cure is the Torah. The Amalek is the Yitzhara himself, right? The Amalek is the embodiment of the Samach Mem, of the forces of Tumah. Any slight diminution, however microscopic it may be, Vayavay Amalek Vayilachem Im Yisrael Berfidim. Rav Chanan Ratzman writes, look at number 3. He ends off, whenever you have a war against any opponent, you got to know what is the strength of your opponent, right? If you know your opponent's plugged into the wall, so you don't have to fight him, you can just unplug him, right? You have to know where is your opponent coming from. And Chazal tell us, where does Amalek come from? Vayilachem im Yisrael berfidim sharafu yedeim min haTorah. In other words, the more we slacken off in Torah, the stronger Amalek comes. But midah tova meruba, which means like this: if even a microscopic diminution in limud haTorah brings Amalek, then even the slightest, however small and undetectable it might be, even the slightest improvement and dedication to limud haTorah spells devastating results to Amalek. Spells devastating.
What?
What?
I mean, you had Havotzas Torah in Europe. And nevertheless,
If you want, we could discuss that privately.
I know your opinion that
But-
it wasn't as much.
But if you want to know, if you're interested, you can read Rabbi Chanan further in the Karvetz Haaretz, and he'll tell you himself about what was happening in Europe. He'll give you his first-hand account. Rabbi Sai, have a good day. Have a good
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.